interesting to know. So, my agenda for today is to go through several different topics, if you will, broadly speaking. Initially, I'm going to start by just walking through my workflow, sort of end to end. And then after I sort of talk through the workflow and talk about the technical aspects of what I do, then I'm going to start working on some musical examples from different genres with different kinds of problem solving or different kinds of approaches, and talk a little bit about how I think about the tools. And then in the last section, we're going to work on a couple of files that were submitted by Godspeed and one other person. So um, I think, but before I dive in to talking about the workflow, I think I just wanted to say a few words both about my background and sort of generally about my approach to mastering. It's important for me to say up front, I started as a musician, and that for me informs everything that I do. Even when I start thinking about the most small details, trying to finesse dither or sample rate conversion or something, ultimately, for me, it can't just be about the technology. It has to be about that it's contributing something, however small, to the end result. And I should say, the thing that gets me excited about all of this is that technology, and from the very beginning, what got me excited about technology is the way it can extend our creative possibilities, the way it enhances our creative process. I don't think of it as an overlay. I think of it as kind of an integral part of the thing that we're creating. So I guess part of the reason that I'm starting by saying this out loud is in part to remind myself about what's important, but also in the context of what's going on in the world around mastering and around music production. I think that as there's been a proliferation of people who are doing the work, home studios, a lot of new people coming into the domain of production and mixing and mastering, um, there's there's a dilution, if you will, a real impact, I think, in general on the quality of what's being produced. And there are some things that are concerning and problematic about it. And it's very easy then to become depressed and to become very kind of precious about thinking that the new people who are trying to do this work are somehow not interested in the things that are important or creating things that are beautiful, and to judge them. And so rather than thinking about things from that approach, I try to find my way in to making beautiful music or interesting music or effective music and meeting young people where they are, to try to encourage them to do the same and to try to tie into their enthusiasm and their interest. I do a lot of teaching at Berklee College of Music, and so I'm always dealing with young people who sometimes I think are less likely initially to sort of understand what it means to make something great. And we have to figure out some way to meet them where they are and bring them along. So, I'm curious, how many of you can remember a time when there were no limiters? Digital limiters. Nobody. Wow. Okay. So when I started working, there were no limiters, no digital limiters, but we still had a loudness war. But anyway, the reason that I sort of introduced this topic, there are many things that are interesting to me about thinking about what the world looked like when there were no limiters, how the aesthetic of music production was different before there were no limiters. The first digital limiters came into my workflow in about 1992. The introduction of the TC Electronics M6000, the younger DO2, those were sort of the earliest versions of digital limiters. And music sounded very different then. And so what the sort of the things that are interesting to me about what has changed are the idea that technology changes music aesthetics, because with the introduction of limiters, the sound of records has changed. But also realizing that technology will continue to change and that the aesthetic of record production will also continue to change. And so we have to be adaptive and adaptable all the time. It also means that I have to remind myself that the records that I love that were made in 1985 or 83 are no longer relevant in some way. So there are aspects of the sound that comes from back then that I love, but I have to not hold on to that too tightly and too preciously because I have to be able to meet the new creative where they are. So the challenges that we're facing now in mastering, I think, are around saturation. There is so much saturation. There's so much use of saturation. The increasing unpredictability of delivery to the audience. When we were cutting vinyl or making CDs, or even making MP3s that people would then play directly from their hard disk, there was a single point of reference. Or listening to the radio, that was another single point of reference. Now we have such a proliferation of ways of delivering the sound out to the listener, the end user, that it becomes almost impossible for us to anticipate how they're going to hear what we're producing. And one of the core elements of mastering is around translation, is to try to figure out how to deliver something that will work across a wide range of different scenarios. So that it's become increasingly difficult. So there's saturation, which I personally find challenging from an aesthetic point of view. There's the diversification of delivery, which also presents some additional challenges. And then there's this current trend around spatial audio, Atmos, Sony 360, MPEG-H, and potentially others. So it creates more and more diffusion, I think, of the audience's experience. It can be very confusing. And then there's AI, which is another topic in the world, which maybe we can talk a little bit later about. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because I actually think it's kind of irrelevant to our craft. But I think these are the sort of things that are in front of us right now as mastering engineers. And not to sort of give away the punchline or the end of the story, but the more diffusion there is, the more complex the ecosystem is, the more I'm inclined to just think about trying to make great sounding records. That ultimately is the answer. It's not about trying to get everything exactly right or know exactly what device. You know, is somebody listening on earbuds, or are they listening in their car, or are they listening on tower speakers, or are they listening from their laptop? We kind of can't care. Are they listening loudness normalized or not loudness normalized? We kind of can't care. So for me, it's about making great sounding records. So I just want to say a couple more things before I dive into talking about workflow. And I think this is just a way of expressing, again, what's meaningful and important to me about the work that I do on behalf of artists and delivering an artistic vision out to the world. I think that there's sometimes a feeling that we shouldn't worry so much about fidelity. We shouldn't worry so much about the details and making great sounding recordings. We shouldn't worry so much about having beautiful studios or having beautiful acoustics, because, you know, that just gets in the way. It creates friction. And so there's a way in which the world sometimes sets the people who care deeply about sound the way that we do in a way that we're in opposition. To be somebody who loves the sound and loves the music and works and fights as hard as we possibly can to get every little last bit of expression and beauty, or whatever the thing is that we're trying to achieve in the communication, out to the audience. And so it's for that reason that I care as much about the performance of the musician as I do about the kind of dither that I use. And I'm sort of thinking deeply about both of those things and everything in between. So I definitely will address these. There are a lot of really interesting and very deep topics, I think, to dive into. That a lot of what I'm hearing seems to raise questions about motivation. And so I'm going to now transition to talking more about the workflow from a sort of a procedural process. I'll talk a little bit about sort of the qualitative aspects of part of the intake and the output, but I'm not going to think initially too much about aesthetics. That'll be in the second section. So when I first receive a project from a client, and I'm looking at the files that they've given me, here are some of the things I need to know right off the bat. Because ultimately what I'm trying to do is build a bridge from what they've given me to what will be delivered out to the world. I mean, that's kind of a very basic description about the role of the mastering engineer. So what do I need to know? I need to know about the sample rate of the files. I need to know about the bit depth of the files. I mean, just, it seems very obvious, but it's not always so obvious to mixing engineers, either what they have or what they might want to give me or to a mastering engineer. And what is the release format going to be? So if it starts, for instance, at 96K or 88.2 or 48, and they want to go to vinyl and CD and streaming, immediately that says a number of things to me, not just about the technical attributes, but there are also some things about level that will play into any decisions that I will make. So that's kind of the first thing I need to know. So if you take a look at this list of files, there are multiple copies of each. You can see that the names are duplicated here. But on the right, I'm looking at the bit rate of the files. And there's a range of values for this project that came in, ranging from 1,411 kilobits per second. Does anybody know what that is in terms of sample rate in bits? I'm going to stop asking you questions. Okay, then there's 2,116 kilobits per second. That's 50% more data. That's 4,424. Cool, okay. So then there's 1,536 kilobits per second, which is a weird one. It's 48K 16 bits. Why somebody would deliver this is beyond me, but this is what I have. Then I have 2,304, which is 4824. And then there's also one outlier, which is 3,072 kilobits per second. What's that, Godspeed?
32 bit, 14 point maybe, and 48.
48K 32-bit float. Okay. So already there's an assortment of things. What do we do? You know, we have to think about, okay, we're starting with all these different sample rates. We know we want to generate a record that has consistency across the sample rates, what to do. And just because a file says it has 24 bits, that doesn't mean it actually has 24 active bits. So when I start looking at a project, for instance, this file that I'm playing says that it's a 24-bit file. But if you take a look at the bit scope in Ozone, you can see that there are only 16 active bits. So I'm not only looking at the labels, but I'm also looking at the contents of the files. Why do I care? Well, maybe a mix engineer made a mistake and set a dither engine set to 16 bits on output, or they just truncated to 16 bits and then saved it as a 24-bit file. I might be able to do them a favor by saying, you know, I notice you only have 16 bits here. Do you have a 24-bit version? Could you give me something that's full resolution? It's a simple thing, but you might as well start. Sometimes I like to think about a cooking metaphor for the work that we do. If you're going to make a beautiful recipe, it's better to start with the best ingredients. If your ingredients aren't as good, no matter how good your technique, the end result won't be as good. So this is why I spend a moment thinking about this. Okay. So, all right. Now, so once I've established what is actually in the files, now I have to think about what to do about it. Um, Typically, when I'm working on a project, I want to work at a single sample rate. I don't want to have to switch my system between different sample rates, partly because it interrupts the continuity of the session. When I'm going from one song to another, comparing them with each other, making sure that they will live together, if I have to reset my clock or jump to another session, it interrupts the flow. So I'm going to decide what sample rate do I want to work at and work with. There are two different ways of coming to thinking about this. One is to say, well, okay, the destination sample rate is going to be, let's say it's 44.1. So I will convert everything to 44.1 so I can hear the music I'm working on at exactly the quality that it will be delivered and make decisions through that lens, if you will. The other, and this is the way I prefer to do it, is to say, let's start with the highest quality possible, generate the best sounding master possible, and then at the end, I will render it to the consumer format. If there's a little bit of a penalty on the back end in terms of doing sample rate conversion, that's okay for today's master. But tomorrow, if somebody wants to release something at a higher bit rate or a higher sample rate, if there's the possibility of selling a 96K version, for instance, they'll have a higher resolution source. So that's my workflow. But you have to make a decision right up front, and those are the sort of two different ways of thinking about it. So for most people, what you would do, I think most mixing engineers, for instance, if you have files with different sample rates, you just drag them into your DAW and let the DAW do a sample rate conversion. And that's fine. It's not a problem. But it may not give you the best result. And again, going back to something I said earlier about fighting to get the best result, I'm going to fight to get the best result. There is a website, I just thought to pull it up. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this now, where somebody has made a comparison of all of these different sample rate conversion tools and evaluated them from the perspective of the quality of the anti-aliasing filter and the noise that's produced in the SRC. It's totally nerdland. I mean, this is not like the thing that's going to make a record win a Grammy. But if you look at something like this, so here's what we're seeing. We're seeing aliasing that shows up in this tool called Goldwave as a result of doing sample rate conversion. It's a terrible, terrible thing. You would never want to sample rate convert with it. If you take a look at, I think they've got Ableton 7. Lots and lots of aliasing here. Ableton 10, much better. So this is just a way of showing you that there are real differences between sample rate converters. And some of the differences are much more subtle than what I was just showing you here. But at the end of the day, for me, because the Isotope RX environment gives me a great deal of control over the quality of the sample rate conversion, this is where I do it. So every time you change sample rate, it's like re-recording something. It's going to go through, if the sample rate needs to be changed, it will be upsampled and then downsampled to the target sample rate. And it will also go through the anti-aliasing filter. And so, for instance, for this demonstration, I'm going to assume I'm going to work at 48K. And the reason that I'm choosing 48K is that a lot of these tracks are already at 48K. So I can keep them at the native sample rate, and there won't be the same sort of sonic penalty to them. And the 44.1 tracks will be upsampled to 48. So some of them will change a little bit, but most of them won't. If I have a project that I think would justify it, I might upsample everything to 96, but just for the case of what I'm doing for this demonstration, I'm just going to use 48K. So if you look at, I pulled everything into the batch processor in RX. So, and it actually indicates sample rate and bit depth for all of the file or the containers. And then I can change the parameters in the sample rate converter. The two things that I usually will play with when I'm adjusting the sample rate conversion are the position of the filter and the phase of the filter. And this gets, again, a little bit nerdy, but you may have you've heard the terminology linear phase versus minimum phase. You at least have heard those words, I assume. So the position of the filter will determine how much, if any, aliasing will show up in the sample rate conversion. And if you watch me scroll down, depending on where the anti-aliasing filter is set, when it crosses the line that represents the Nyquist filter, you will see the level at which aliasing appears. So if I move the anti-aliasing filter off to the right, the aliasing starts at a higher level. If I move it to the left, there's less of it. Certain kinds of program material, like hard rock or something, a little bit of aliasing might not be a problem. For high fidelity, beautiful classical music, it's a problem. Like aliasing is a drag. We don't want it. So that will inform a little bit of my decision making here. So if I come up here, you will see that not only does the position matter, but also the slope of the filter. With a shallow slope, I'm going to get more aliasing sooner. But a shallow filter sounds better. So there's a trade-off between the two settings. Usually I don't want to roll off information down to 19K or 18K, so I won't let the filter get that shallow. But I also don't want aliasing to start at too high a level. So something like this is kind of a good starting point for me in terms of the position of the filter. And the other thing is the time domain performance of the filter. I will tell you, in general, I don't really like the sound of pre-ringing that comes from linear phase filters, but linear phase filters maintain the most accuracy in the time domain. Analog EQ has kind of a nice, thick, slightly smeared sound to it, which might be very musical when you're mixing, but in the context of sample rate conversion, it's too colorful. The nice thing about this tool is I can actually set an in-between state for the anti-aliasing filter. So rather than have it be analog or fully linear phase, I'll set it about a quarter of the way off to the left. And for me, that gives the best trade-off between accuracy in the time domain, reducing the amount of pre-ringing, but also not having the result be too terribly thin. In the other thing that I might do at this stage, I don't do it all the time, but if I suspect that the levels of all of the different materials submitted might be wildly varied, I also might do a loudness normalization pass at the same time. Not because I want to compress or limit or anything, but because it's actually helpful to have an initial general level set. And if I were to let me take these files that I just created without the loudness normalization. Here we go. So here they are. These are the 48K 24-bit files. I'm going to pull them into this session. And you can see that the levels vary quite significantly between all of the tracks. So I'm going to use a loudness normalization target, if you will, that's much lower than any of the mix files would have shown up at. So I don't incur any kind of clipping or limiting. So I might use something like -20 or -22. That way the files would be then conformed to that LKFS level. The thing you have to be careful about, and I'm sure you are already aware of this, is that you need to understand the level of the file that was submitted so that when you master something, if the level is going to be quieter than what was submitted, you talk to the client about that before you give it back to them. Because if you ultimately turn down the level a lot and then don't turn it back up and give a master back to a client that's quieter than where you started, they will probably look at you like you're crazy. So you have to prepare them in a way where you say, well, the track might be a little quieter than where it started, but listen to how much better it sounds, and the bass is better, and it's, whatever the things are that you feel have been improved. So I make a note about what the level was coming in, but then I might do a loudness normalization pass for the level set for the beginning of my mastering session. So I just ran a loudness normalization pass. I'll throw these in just so you can compare the different wave shapes before and after. Note to mix engineers, right? I mean, you can see the limiting, and now it makes you a little concerned. You know, um, what do I want to say about this? So, somebody earlier was asked a question that had to do with how much the quality of the mix influences the result of the master. And while I don't think it will come as a surprise to you to hear me say this, if you are limiting as a mixing engineer just for level, stop. Because in mastering, we need headroom. We need to have to gain stage in order to do our work. So for every dB that you're pushing just to get level, there's a dB that might have to get pulled back down in order to create headroom. You're sort of working against yourself. However, if a limiter is part of what makes a track sound great, cool. I mean, if you can't make the track sound the way you want it to sound without it, then we'll deal with it as mastering engineers. So when you see a shape like what you're seeing in some of these tracks, and obviously I'm zoomed way out, but that's really very, very flat, and I can predict something about the sound of what we would hear if I were to play this track. It'll be very sort of flat. Okay, so now that I've just gotten to the starting line with the session, now I will pull all of the tracks. I'm assuming, well, in this case, I'm not just working on a single. I'm working on multiple tracks at a time. So the next thing I need to know is what's the order of an album. Artists don't always understand how important this is. I think that thinking about the audience's experience and the journey that they're going to go on influences what we do in thinking about tone and thinking about level. So it's very important that an artist gives a mastering engineer an order to start with, even if they're not sure. It's very easy to go back later and resequence things. But if the artist says to a mastering engineer, "Oh, you decide," the number of possible orders when you have 10 tracks is 10 factorial, which is somewhere in the hundreds of thousands of possible orders. And most artists don't want to pay mastering engineers to try them all, especially not if you're charging by the hour. So I need to know what the order is. All right, so maybe I'll talk a little bit later about when I have 10 songs or 5 songs or 3 songs, which song I work on first. I don't always start at the beginning and work through to the end, depending on some of the variables. Actually, maybe I'll talk about it now quickly. Usually, if there are 10 songs and they're all fairly consistent, I'll start at the beginning. But if there were 7 songs that had a similar arrangement and density of arrangement, and 3 songs that were a little bit different, I might start with the 7 first because they kind of set a general tone for the whole record. If there's one song that sounds better, one mix that sounds better than all the other mixes, I'll start with that one because that will set the standard for my work, and I will try to make everything sort of come up to that. Not always possible. So where I begin, depends on a number of different factors. If there were 10 songs where 7 were like full-on rock tracks and then the other 3 were solo piccolo, I wouldn't start with the piccolo tracks. I would start with the rock tracks. Yeah, I don't want to work on a piccolo record anyway. It's like too painful. Okay, does anybody here play piccolo? No, okay, good. We're fine. Actually, so before I move on, I'm going to just quickly play Oh, let me say, first of all, thank you to Media Integration and Focal for bringing these speakers in. I don't know if you know, is that just like a quick sample of each track. Um, just to point out that loudness normalization it's a clever idea. It's helpful, but it's not perfect. So I've loudness normalized all of these to the same standard in much the same way that Spotify or Apple Music or Tidal do that when listeners have loudness normalization turned on. But you'll hear that there's still some adjustments that need to be made because the loudness normalization doesn't 100% accurately predict loudness. So that's a little hotter. I don't know what this is. This is scary, but it needs to be a little quieter. Right, that just doesn't quite make sense between those two. It sounds fuller. That's really hot. Wow. So again, they've all been loudness normalized, but there's some really big differences there. This is why people matter. You know, it's important for us to help curate a result based on how our brains really work, not just what the machine does. So now I'm going to continue with talking about the workflow, and then we'll come back later and, as I promised before, dive a little bit more into aesthetics. So let's assume that now these files are all fully mastered and laid out with the spacing that we want in between the tracks. Thank you. So I haven't done any editing or anything, just so this is just sort of theoretical or hypothetical. And by the way, some people still seem to think that you always put 2 seconds between all the songs on a record. This is not true. For a punk rock record, sometimes they want to be really fast. Or for a concept album, you want to have no space. Or for a live album, you want to have no space. Or for a jazz record, you might want to have 5 seconds. Or for a classical record in between pieces, you might want to have 8 seconds. So it's always driven by the aesthetic and the genre. And it's not the same in between each of the songs. You may already know this, but I feel that it's important to say it out loud. So once the album's EQ'd, compressed, leveled, whatever is going to happen, and sequenced, now it's time to create metadata. The metadata we create in mastering is a little bit different than it is in other parts of the workflow. Obviously, any DAW can create markers, but the metadata that indicates track artist and album name and album artist is something that mastering DAWs facilitate. So I've created markers. As you can see, every song now has a track start and a track end. And there's also text for each marker. I need to go through and manually edit the text so that the name of the track is exactly what you want it to be when it's rendered out. And this is tedious work, obviously, to get all this information correct. But if it's not correct, it could be a disaster when something goes out into the world. You've heard the term, you can fix it in the mix? You ever hear that before, that phrase? Or there's a term, we'll fix it in mastering. That's possible. Nobody has ever said, we'll fix it in distribution. Once something goes out into the world and there's a mistake, the mistake is there. And it's a problem for the artist, and it's a problem for our reputation as mastering engineers. So getting all this information correct is important. Not only are we including things like album title and album artist, track title and track artist, but there is also information called ISRC codes. ISRC codes are the unique tags that get included with every digital musical version, whether it's a song or a classical composition or what have you. And that's the way that the number of plays is determined. So it's the digital radio or streaming services don't read the text, they read the ISRC. So in the context of this DAW Sequoia, I can embed the ISRC in the metadata. And I can also provide a PDF document that includes all the ISRCs as well, and that can go out in various, to the various distributors. So the markers or the metadata will vary depending on the output format. If we are rendering something out for streaming, then, and we're rendering out more than a single, then we always render from the beginning of one track to the beginning of the next. That way the space at the end of the track is included in the file. And so if somebody plays an album all the way through, they'll hear the spacing that you intend at the end of each song. If we're rendering a master for CD, which some people still do, they want to make CDs, then we render a table of contents that includes end markers at the end of each track, assuming that there's a gap of any length between the tracks. Because the CD player, the way it reads the table of contents and the structure of the table of contents allows for having an end marker or a proper end marker. If we're rendering something out for vinyl, then we render out a whole side. So from the beginning of side A to the end of side A, and then the beginning of side B to the end of side B, with all of the timing information within the documents. So we have to do it differently depending on the format. So I've got a project that I'm mastering. It's 48K. Here's what I'm going to deliver at a minimum to the client. I'm going to give them 48K 24-bit versions, and I'm going to give them 44.1 16-bit versions. That's the minimum. That usually covers what most people, modern musicians, need. If they're going to make a CD, I'll also make a DDP file set, or a vinyl master if they want vinyl. So you see I've created 3 folders already here. My next step is going to be to export the 48K 24-bit versions, because that's what I've laid out in this session. So I'm going to put everything in that folder. You can see the format is 4824. I'm going to set it so it exports from track start to track start, like I said before, and hit go. And now, if I look at the folder where I'm working, you'll see that it's rendering out WAV files at 4824 with the track number connected to it. It's sort of rendering them out. Okay, great. So I'm going to let it finish doing this. How many did I? 14 songs. If you want to just say what I said, because it's going to take another 30 seconds, and then I can go to the next. So now that I've got the 48K versions, if I need to render out a 44.1 version, I'm going to take all of those files and guess what? Use RX to do the sample rate conversion down to 4424. Come on. Forty-eight 24 was the first, and now I'm going to set the sample rate converter to 44, and then do a sample rate conversion at 44, and I'm going to put the files, if RX will behave, which it is now. Thank you very much. Oops, not that. There we go, into my Dropbox, into the Media Integration Bootcamp, into the empty Bootcamp, into 4424. Put them in there, please. Yes, and go. Okay. So now we have the 44.1 files being rendered out. So I've got the tracks at 48.24, 44.24. I could also render them at 44.16, but the last thing that I will do is create a new session, which is going to have the same name as what I've been working on. There we go. Okay. And I think I was just calling this empty bootcamp. And so the last thing I can do at this point is make a DDP master for CD. So that gets me all the way through all of the different formats, sort of end to end in terms of my workflow. The one thing you have to do is QC the result. Because I've done 3 rendering steps, and I haven't listened to any of these files. You have to listen to the result. But you don't have to listen to all 3. Because if you start with the 48K and make the 4424 from that, and make 4416 from that, if 4416 sounds cool, then by extension, the 2 versions before sound cool too. So I'll always do a QC to that final version. So now, I'm going to go through a few different kinds of projects, each of which have very different aesthetics and different kinds of challenges, and talk about how I approach them. So someone earlier was talking about, well, hopefully I will answer at least one of the questions that came up earlier, which is when you listen to a project, let me start by saying it this way. Understanding the client, understanding the music, and understanding how who the client is and what they need is really, really important. If a client sends me something and it's clear to me that they are very inexperienced and there's a big problem with a track, I might try to fix it for them because I wouldn't necessarily have the confidence that they would be able to incorporate my feedback and fix it themselves. If I'm working with a client who's very experienced and I hear something that's problematic, then I might ask them to think about, to listen. If I recognize the problem, say, I think that let's say the vocal's a little bit undermixed, could be a little louder. If they agree with me, maybe they'll give me a new mix. If the client's release date is tomorrow, I will not ask for a new mix. But in every case, I always have to recognize, there are always compromises involved, and I have to recognize how much I can do and how much I shouldn't try to do. And not get mixing and mastering confused. The quickest way to ruin a project is to try to remix it in mastering. Okay. So the first project that I'm going to play is a project that was recorded at Berklee College of Music as part of the Berklee Global Jazz Institute. And this was nominated for a Grammy last year. Did not win, but the nomination is a win. As you can hear, it's a very dynamic, very unusual sort of combination of instruments. It doesn't fit into any sort of typical, I think, musical constructs in popular culture. It's not a pop record, it's not a reggae record, it's not a jazz record. I guess it's world music. And so there is no simple way to think about the sound. It's like, oh, it should sound like every other pop record. Um, the record was recorded and mixed by very experienced engineers. So the assumption is that they worked very hard to make it sound the way it sounds. So as a mastering engineer, I'm not coming into this thinking I know better. Right? I really have to sit with it and try to understand what they were after. What is it about the presentation, the thing that I'm hearing, that is at the heart of the music, and work to maintain that, to not destroy it. But at the same time, as the mastering engineer, I have to think about level, right? Make sure that the record is at a hot enough level to play out in the world. Think about dynamics. There's a lot of dynamic change in this music, and there is such a thing as too much dynamics in music that makes it hard for the audience if something gets too quiet and too loud or too shrill. And figure out a way to build a bridge between this interesting thing created by very experienced people and the thing that I think will work in the world. So let's just listen a little bit together. Let me just say, I'm going to set the level of the playback. Okay, I'm going to set it there, and now I'm not going to touch it. So when I listen to the different sections, I'll understand how they relate to each other. I'm going to jump forward a little. So I'm going to jump around a little bit, but this was the internal dynamic structure just in one piece, track 2. To remind myself about track 1. So one of the things I'm picking up, well, actually I'm picking up 2 things so far. One is the dynamics are much bigger in the first track than the second. The first track sounds a little louder, at least at its hottest moment, compared to the second. There's more sound coming from the speakers. And overall, the sound seems pretty consistent, pretty stable, but a little bright. These are the things that are going through my head so far. Now, obviously, I would listen all the way through all these pieces. I'm jumping around a little bit, partly to, for the sake of time, right, and efficiency. Yep. So track number 3. Okay. So I'm going to start making I'm going to try some things. I was going to say I'm going to make some decisions, but I reserve the right to change my mind. uh, let's take a look at the level. Okay. So I'm just looking at RMS and peak. And one of the things I'm noticing is even at the hottest level, it's getting up to like minus 14 RMS, which will roll up to about minus 14 LKFS also, momentary. That's too low. It's going to produce a record that's just going to be a little too quiet for the commercial market, which makes me scared because this is very delicate and very dynamic. So let me also take a look at where my peak level is. And I've got 1.5 dB there. I've got 2.5 dB there. So if I leave everything at the same level where it is, I can get 1 more dB without changing anything, which is not enough. So note to self, I'm going to have to change something. So now this is where the work begins, right? It's like, how do we start to adapt it so it's going to work better for the listener, and think about the implications for the fidelity of the material. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to investigate is how much I can push the level into a limiter without hurting the music. You know, can I get a little bit of gain by pushing the level into the limiter and still be okay with the resulting sound? I'm also going to choose a limiter mode that I anticipate is going to be favorable for this style, which is IRC3 in the ozone maximizer, which is the offers the least distortion, highest fidelity. It's got a good long buffer, and it'll maintain the articulation of the sound better than any of the other modes. I'm also setting a few other parameters the way I think I'll want them, but I'm not going to get too tweaky yet. Okay.
Is it dark or light?
So in moments like that, it's too much. I hear the impact on the attack of the piano. It's flattening the top of the dynamic too much. So I figure I can get about 3 dB maximum into the limiter. So this is less about it's more about maintaining aesthetic than creating an aesthetic experience, but I'm trying to get the level up as much as I can without hurting something. So 3 dB, I think, for this initial move is all I'm going to get. And by the way, I'm also taking the output of the limiter and turning it down by a fraction, somewhere between 0.7 and 1, because ultimately I will need to leave a little margin in the files when I export. I can answer questions about that later, but yep. So for this record, there's enough consistency in the sound that I can use a single limiter that's going to sit on the output for all the tracks. I might do something subtly different with EQ or with compression, but I can change the playback level to reduce it into the limiter to change the amount of limiting per track, but I don't feel the need to use a separate limiter for each song. In some of the examples we'll look at later, I would make a different decision. So I've got the maximizer sitting on playback coming out of that single track that's got all the songs on it. So now I'm going to play each of the tracks and play with the relative level between them. Before, when I was listening, I had the sense that track 1 got loudest at its peak compared to 3, but especially 2. So I'm going to play with the gain staging of the record. I'm not going to get too tweaky about it, but I just making some small adjustments, it feels like the level is matched a little bit better at the hottest sections. So the next thing I have to think about is what to do next. Do I address the tone overall? And earlier I said I thought it was bright, but I might refine that statement. And then there's also the extreme dynamics in the project. I think my inclination is to start with the EQ and see if I can improve the tone a little bit, and then start working on the dynamics. There'll be an iterative process, because when you change tone and then you compress, the compression will change the tone. But the reason that I'm going to do it the way I'm going to do it is that I'm going to use the EQ to make it sound as good as I can, and then fight to retain as much of that goodness as possible, even when I compress. That's my thought process right now. And I want to refine this word bright that I used before, because I don't think that it's actually got too much treble. I think there's a diffuse character. I can't hear the notes as clearly as I would like to hear them, and that's what I'm looking to address with the EQ.
Is it light or dark, or shades of gray? Rise from the love, rise from the
So this is kind of an initial EQ gesture. I'm looking to see if I don't know how to put this except to sort of realign the sound a little bit, to refine it. I felt like there was a little too much edgy uh, energy in the strings, like around 5K. I felt like there was a little bit too much resonance in the mid range, like around 500 hertz. I felt like the very low end could be pulled down a little bit so it was a little less heavy. And then I restored some of the brilliance and the clarity in the top end with a shelf. So you can see the general shape of the EQ. Um, period. I'm not using very, very narrow filters. And that's for at least two reasons. One is narrow band filters generally don't sound so musical. They're great for problem solving very specific kinds of issues, but they don't map very well to tone and sort of complex signals and adjusting the tone of complex signals. Um, and the artifact of a wide Q, of a wide bandwidth, is less. I'm also using analog EQ. I'm not using linear phase. Um, I think the result is more pleasing in general. So, all right. I just want to, now that I've taken a moment, I'm going to listen again. Yeah, I mean, I like the focus. I like the warmth. I feel like I hear the notes better. It's not like a huge difference. Like you're not going to think, oh wow, there's a lot more bass, or but I feel like I hear the music better. Like I can hear the notes. I mean, trying to work very hard to maintain the balance between the instruments. One of the things that you learn very quickly in mastering is that you can change the balance of a mix with EQ. And it's a weird idea because we don't think about EQ in that way. Usually when you're a mix engineer, you think about balance as fader moves. But in a sense, in mastering, each EQ filter is like a fader, but the fader is controlling part of the spectrum that favors one instrument group or another. But I actually think it's a flattering initial gesture. Just a side note, the name of this record is Chrysalida, and the intention of the record is to give hope to the world about, in spite of all the struggle in our lives and in our world, that we might just be a chrysalis, like what a butterfly grows from. So it's supposed to be about what we might become. And I was just reminded of that, and there's something about feeling the intention that I think helps me love the music and love the work. So anyway, I back to EQ. So I just copied the EQ settings to the other two tracks because I'm thinking maybe they would represent a good starting point. I'll have to refine it for each one of the tracks, but they come from the same engineer, the same mix room. Let's see what happens. Okay, so I had to make some changes. I was pulling out too much in the mid range, and the high frequency, the center frequency and the high end needed to be different, and it didn't really need so much of a high end boost. Um, But the other thing I'm noticing is that the image of this track is a little bit wider than the image on the first one. So I'm going to go back to the first track and use the imager just to add a little bit of a sense of width and depth.
Rise from
Yeah, so a little bit goes a long way. The usable range of the imager in Ozone is really just like between 0 and 10. If you start doing anything really big, it's too much. It's my experience. So just adding a little bit of the uncorrelated signal feels like it's giving me the same sort of vivid sense of the music coming from the full width of the image. And it also feels like it's unmasking the mix a little bit. So I think I like it. So it may be that the presence of the talking drum is what is making a little bit of a difference in how much low frequency energy is coming from the speakers. Or it may be that the mix engineer just had ramen that day instead of pizza and was mixing a little bit differently. But it feels like the low mid range is just a little different here. So I'm going to make some adjustments to that track. You shouldn't master after eating pizza, actually, is really what I want to say.
soñar.
So slowly the tone of the three tracks is becoming a little bit more similar. The sound stage is becoming a little bit more similar. They're becoming a little bit more similar. um, and going back to my original statement about this record, if I try to reinvent the sound, it's going to make the artist angry, and I won't get paid. So really, I'm trying to do what I can to reveal what I'm hearing in the performance and in the arrangement without being obvious. I don't want them to know I've been there. All right, so now I'm going to investigate, and I'm going to investigate the compression. Um, I don't know how. I mean, I feel like I need to say doing the work and talking about the work at the same time slows you down. It would probably take me about 30 to 45 minutes per track to do this work. So what I'm doing right now is giving you a sense of my approach, but I will not get at the fully refined result that I would have if I was not talking to you. Um, I don't know if you want to convey that if you think it's important, but let me spend a little time seeing if I can get the compression to work and talking about that, and then we can take a break. Um, so here, the notion of compression is really just about reducing the difference between high and low amplitude, but I don't want to change timbre, and I don't want to restrain the articulation in the music. Um, so that leads me to think about what is the most transparent approach that I can use to compression. And rather than doing sort of strong top-down compression, I'm going to probably use parallel compression. So the idea is to try to reinforce the low-level signals so that quiet never gets quite as quiet as it would have otherwise. And I hope that you won't notice the compression, especially as the signal gets strong. So it won't sound squashed. It won't sound compressed. So my recipe for relatively transparent, unnoticeable compression is to use an RMS detector, not a peak detector. When you use a peak detector, the compressor responds fast to changes in the signal. I don't want it to respond so fast that you're like, oh, I hear compression. To filter the sidechain so that the low frequency portion of the signal won't drive the compressor. Once again, that way the compressor is less likely to shift suddenly when there's a drum or some very low frequency signal. To have a medium attack and a long release. And also relatively hard knee, because I don't want the compressor to start compressing at too low a level, if that makes sense. So those are the different parameter choices I'm going to make, or sort of an initial recipe, and then I'm going to listen to it and see if it actually works.
Is it light or dark, or shades of gray? Rise from love.
Okay, so I started out with a compressor full on. You see the ratio is very, very low. And if I listen to it 100% wet, you hear that there's 5 dB of compression, like a ridiculous amount of compression for something like this. But then I'm changing the dry-wet mix, so the end result is maybe up to a dB of compression. There's a little more compression when the signal is hotter, and I can use that number of 0.7, 0.8, 1 dB of compression to increase the makeup gain overall. So the loud portion of the signal remains stable. We're not losing any level, but when the signal gets quiet, we're getting about a dB more gain. So there's like a dB less difference between loud and quiet. It's a subtle, subtle change.
En un mundo sereno, donde sin el amor, donde no haya murallas que separen por color, nuestros brazos abiertos para esta transformación, libertad implacable, ilusión de nuevo sol, acogiendo los frutos, celebrando nuestra unión.
This track doesn't need as much compression. It's a little bit more even, and I'm hearing the signature of the compressor on the low mid-range a little more, so I'm backing it off. All right, and then the third track. That's working pretty well there. So, all right. That's without. That's with. It's a very subtle difference, but it feels like it's moving the very quiet voices about 4 inches closer to me. Okay, so I'm just going to take maybe 3 minutes and play a little bit of the finished master so you can hear where it ended up, and then we can take our next short break, and then I can move from this example that involves a lot of subtlety into some examples that will require a much heavier hand. This was the original mix. So that's where it started.
Where are we going?
That's the master.
Is it light or dark, or shades of gray? Rise from love. Rise from love.
And I will say, I mean, I might be going crazy, but the master has a slightly more emotional. I have a slightly more emotional response to it. Um, Before we take this break, are there any questions that you have about anything that I just did or was talking about?
パラレルコンプレッションを使うのと同じ目的で、例えば別の選択肢としてアップワードコンプレッションとかもあると思うんですけど、それを試すことはあるのかとか、もし両方とも選択肢としてあるのであれば、どういう時にどっちを選ぶのかみたいな話を。
What is upward compression?
Make the flight signals hotter.
Just harder.
So what was I just doing?
Yeah.
The same thing. I mean, it's no different. All I'm doing is reinforcing the low-level RMS signal. I know that ozone has a new upward compress, which is it's a weird phrase. It doesn't really mean anything, but the reason I didn't choose that is the time constants are too slow, and so it's my preference. But it really is exactly the same idea. I'll tell you the other thing, that the other rationale or the other reason is the position of the tool, because you'll see I've got the compressor in the first position. If you were to use the upward compression in the limiter, you can't get anything between it and the limiter, right? I mean, it is just in this single environment. So I like being able to reposition it in the signal flow. So for those two reasons, I won't use it. Yeah, I mean, there's another set of tools called impact, which in a sense you could say it does something similar, especially when you play with the amount. It's almost like parallelizing it, but here again the attack time is so fast that it'll take out, I think, a lot of the interesting dynamic feature of the music. Sure. Let's see if I can give you a quick example. Sometimes I think listening to it I'm going to do something ridiculous and radical to illustrate the point. So by pulling out in the presence region, it leaves you with more of the body, the sound of the bass, the kick drum. It's a major sort of rebalancing of the spectrum, but also the instruments that inhabit the different parts of the spectrum present differently. This is like a crazy amount of change, but even subtle changes can have that impact. So this is a subtler change. This is a dB and a half, just under 200 hertz with a Q of 3. It's a small move. So see if you can hear this. When I turn it on and off, the intelligible part of the bass shifts. So with it in, I mean, everything feels like it's clearer, but you lose a little body in the voice. You lose a little bit of fullness in the snare. And especially you're not able to make out the note from the bass so well, just by this little move. So it's changing the internal relationship or balance. within the mix. And then if you had two or three little EQ moves, it can make a bigger difference. So let me just having said that out loud, see if this makes sense to you. Turn the EQ off at first.
Ooh, you know it's like
Actually, the kick drum changes too, the pulse. I mean, it really changes the relationships between the instruments. It's bizarre. It's like this tiny little move. Yeah, it's cool. I mean, it's, so you have to be really sensitive about that, but it also means if you need to change a relationship like that, if I wanted to liberate the voice a little bit more and kind of unmask the low mid range, that would be a way to do it. So, any other questions before we break? So, here's the first thing to know. Multiband is not, it's strong medicine. It makes changes in the sound that you may or may not intend. And so it's not to be used. I only use it when it's the best tool to solve a problem, because I know I'm going to end up taking a step back in order to take two steps forward. And really, so I don't want to be too abstract about all of this. But when you put a multiband tool in, you put a high pass and a low pass filter in the signal path. And that creates a big phase shift right around the crossover, and you lose clarity. Let me put a multiband tool in here with no compression. Everything is one-to-one. And I've got the crossover right around here, right? So it's affecting, it's living right around the body of the snare drum and the voice. If I turn it off, there's no compression happening. It's just the multiband implementation. It changes a lot. So now maybe you like the sound better with it in, that's cool, but you probably weren't thinking about the change in tone when you implement the multiband compressor. So there are times when frequency-specific compression is the best approach, but I will only use multiband when it is the best approach, mostly for this reason. Yeah, simple is better. Really, less is more, until you need more, and then more is more. I was thinking the next thing I would do is dig into a 3-song EP and just talk about my approach to it. And this is a project that needs some help. But before, I'm looking back at some of the questions that were raised at the very beginning of the session and thought maybe I'd try to quickly go through at least a couple of them. I mean, my way of thinking about the work that we're doing is that in mixing and in mastering, we're trying to realize an arrangement. I think mixing is very much like, it is kind of the technical aspect of what the arranger does. It's kind of giving a voice to an arrangement. And I think mastering in some ways is kind of like putting the polish on that so that the arrangement is as available as possible to the listener. That's the way I listen, and that's the way I think about the work and what I'm doing. So anyway, so that's that. Somebody asked about. Oh, it's somebody. I think you were talking about the fact that you were doing it all yourself. That's hard. The reason that I think it's hard is that You lack the advantage that comes from having another perspective on your work. You are inevitably going to be stuck a little bit in the echo chamber of your own thinking. When you create an arrangement, you have an idea in your mind, and then when you mix the track, you have the same idea in your mind. And then when you master your mix, you're still in your same mind, in your same space, same speakers, and you're the same person. And so it's very hard to get the advantage of having somebody say, actually, maybe have you considered that, the strings could be a little louder, or have you considered that maybe the trombone is getting in the way of the trumpet, or whatever it is. Um, so it's not that it's impossible to do, but it's very hard to do and keep perspective along the way. And it's also, to my mind, there's a reason that we have a separate word for mixing and mastering. They're two different things. Mixing is trying to voice the arrangement. Mastering is trying to rebalance or make sure that the balance is correct in the mix. Um, and mastering tends to be listening and looking from a zoomed out perspective, as opposed to working from the inside of the instrumentation. So anyway, why don't you? Another question that somebody asked is, how do you know what to do and when to stop? So yeah, practice listening a lot so that you have internalized an idea of what something might sound like. That's how you know what to do. You understand genre, you understand balance, you understand, tonal balance, and the more you practice, the more quickly you understand when you hear something that needs to be changed. And how do you know when to stop? When you can't make something better anymore, you can only make it different. Then you're done. Yeah, references can be useful to help you understand tone generally and level generally. If you use references and interpret them too literally, it can become a problem because one song, will inevitably mixes sound different and balances sound different, even if they're in the same genre. So unless you're just trying to really make a sound alike, where it's like, okay, I've got a Sia track and I want to make my track sound like that Sia track, you'd probably do that in the mix and then follow through in mastering. So as a general help, cool. But and here's, I think, again, ideally, I think we internalize a reference for ourselves in our spaces. I mean, so that when you hit play, you immediately know, oh, that sounds dull, or that violin sounds thin, or whatever it is. You sort of have this intuition that you can rely on, and I think that helps us operate more instinctively and more quickly and in a way that's more satisfying in getting to an end result. Um, I have a funny story to tell about what happens when artists give you references because they don't always know, you know, sort of what it is you will actually do with a reference. I don't think it makes sense for me to tell this story right now, but I guess I could try to give you a very quick version. There was an artist who, she was a singer-songwriter, kind of slightly towards jazz, um, and she said, I really like that Nora Jones record with Don't Know Why, that very famous song. And so I heard her record, and it didn't really sound like that. Her voice was a little thin. The recording was much more like a traditional sort of acoustic jazz setting. And so I thought, oh, well, this is what she wants. So I started to work on her record to make it sound more like the Nora Jones record, and warmed it up a little bit, set her vocal in the balance of the instruments a little bit more. And I sent it to her, and she said, oh, it sounds like you've set my vocal into the balance a little bit more and made it sound. And I thought, well, isn't that okay? No, I'm just going to make your record sound good the way I think it should sound. And I sent it back to her a second time, and she said, that's great. And I said, so what was up with the Nora Jones record? And she said, I just like Nora Jones. So, references can be tricky. The last question I'm going to answer now, and then I'm going to start working on this next EP. Somebody asked about what's changed and digital versus analog. That question. And I'm going to try to answer it briefly. Wave behavior is wave behavior. Period. So whether you're using digital or analog tools, we're still just manipulating sound waves, and we're going to hear them as sound waves. It's the same medium. The main difference between digital and analog, three differences. Aliasing, which is something that shows up in digital, it doesn't show up in analog, so you have to be careful about it. Feedback loop and compression is a little different. The behavior is a little different in DSP compared to analog. And then chaos, which shows up in analog and doesn't show up in digital. You never know. It's like a rescue dog, right? You never know. Like someday it might behave a little differently because of what it's lived in its life when you work with analog. So you have to be careful. So the next project, this is a three songs from a longer record, from an artist where the 3 tracks were mixed by 3 different people. And the challenge is to make them work together and to help establish a sense of the artist identity and also a good listening experience. After you've interpreted this, I'm going to hit play, and the first thing I'm going to do is level match and just try to get them into the same ballpark with each other so I can understand what the differences are. And I'm checking headroom, and I have a dB of headroom on one mix file, I have 2 dB on another, and I have 6 on another. I think I'm going to need more. So first thing I'm going to do is bring everything down 3 dB.
She don't look back. She's not asking for it, but it's come in the blink of an eye. I didn't mean it. They can't pin this one. See her me. I need an alibi. I need an alibi in my dreams. So the time will come. The time's there to take your heartbeat. 45 years, give or take. I gotta get away. They can't pin this one on me.
Okay. So, what am I listening for when I'm level matching? 2 things. I'm listening for the vocal, because the vocal is kind of an anchor, and the vocal lives in the mid-range. And I'm also listening for the mid-range. Why am I listening for the mid-range? Well, if you think about what every playback system in the world has in common, it's its ability to portray mid-range, right? To reproduce 500 hertz to 3K, something like that, whether it's a tiny little speaker or a great big speaker. So that doesn't mean we don't care about bass or care about treble, but if you're thinking about translation and consistency, making sure, paying special attention to make sure that there's not too much dynamic change in the mid-range in one track compared to another is important. And it will start to drive some decision-making around compression. So the next thing I'm going to do is look at my output level. I'm going to go back to this first track. And kind of in keeping with what I was thinking about before about level at the very beginning of the last record, in order to sort of satisfy the client, satisfy the genre, and get the record into the ballpark, I know that I want to see a level in this genre of somewhere around minus 10-ish at the peak, at the hottest level. So I'm using level into the limiter just to establish a baseline level across these 3 tracks. So I've I've got 9 dB of gain with this first track, but I've turned the input down 3 dB, so I've actually got 6 dB of gain in the end result. All right, so here we go.
She's not asking for it.
So immediately, the first track is a little sharp, it's a little too much bite. The third track, the drums are really dull. So I'm making these sort of general observations, which are going to be part of what defines, what I'm going to try to solve. So I'm going to work on both of these for a few minutes, and then we'll talk about what I did.
So this, she's a fragile statue and she'll cash in her chips. She's the invisible girl. Everyone turns their head. Everyone can see her, but she can't see herself. She's the invisible girl. The girl is thinking, how could it be? How can she feel this way? No one can see. She's the invisible girl. Everyone turns their head. Everyone can see her, but she can't see herself. She loves me. He loves me not. She loves me not. Watch her walk in the room. She's crazy, gorgeous, and sad. I turn my head. She don't look back. She's the invisible girl. Everyone turns their head. Everyone can see her, but she can't see herself. She looks into the glass, and there's no one looking back. She's the invisible girl. She's the invisible girl. So this, she's a fragile statue. Time to lift off. Let there be rock. Time will come, the bell will toll. Tuesday afternoon or Saturday night. Turn off the ticker, switch off the light. Close your eyes. Nighty night. Daddy looks so young, still feels the same. It's just a number, it's still today. 25 years, give or take your heartbeat. 35 years, give or take your heartbeat. Tuesday afternoon or Saturday night. Turn off the ticker, switch off the light. It's just a number, 25, everyone can see. Time to lift off. Let there be rock. But she can't see herself. She's the invisible girl. The girl is thinking, how could it be? How can she feel this way? No one can see. She's the invisible girl. Everyone turns their head. Everyone can. The time will come. The bell will toll.
What is he doing? He's working on the drums in the mix.
Speaker, switch off the light. Close your eyes. Nighty night. Daddy looks so young, still feels the same. It's just a number. It's still today.
All right, so far I've just focused on those two. Slowly they're moving towards each other. You said something earlier about how you can't change things in mastering like balance. You know, with AI and these AI-enabled tools, we actually can start to reach more deeply into a mix and rearrange things, whether it's balance or in this case, I'm just trying to get unpack the drums a little bit, because in the original mix they were just so, it felt like somebody had thrown a sock over the drum kit. You know, it's like it had no sort of brightness and no excitement to it. I also did something in this track that I really don't like doing, which is to use mid-side. But in this case, the guitar tone, is that where I did it? I hope it, yeah. The guitar tone was so like 1980s Tom Scholz Rockman. It's just had a little bit too much sort of nasty bite to it. And fortunately, it's panned out wide, so I pulled up a mid-side EQ and got it to sort of sit back a little bit so it wouldn't be so piercing.
Everyone turns their head. Everyone can see her, but she can't see herself. She's the invisible girl. The girl is thinking, how could it be?
That kick is just too muscular for the track. So I'm pulling in all the big guns now.
Everyone turns their head. Watch her walk in the room. She's crazy, gorgeous, and
Yeah, it's helping keep the low frequency transient a little bit more in check. That's helping. All right, so now I'm going to go to the real.
in the blink of an eye. I didn't mean it. I wanna get away.
So this is an interesting challenge, this song, because the vocal is very clear and present and forward. And when the vocal isn't singing, the other instruments that contain the tone, the tonal information, and, you know, they sort of drop away. So it feels like the vocal is here and then he stops singing and then suddenly everything else is too far away. And if somebody's listening on a little speaker to this track, it's going to sound totally empty. So I've got to figure out some way to build up the tonal information through the mid-range. The first thing you might think of doing is compression, but I think you would probably immediately see how compression wouldn't work very well for this track, because you'd hear like this weird pumping in the bass given where the vocal level sits. So in this case, actually, saturation may be helpful as a tool to um, make the mid-range, add some intelligibility to the mid-range in general, and bring up the tone of the instruments that are accompanying the voice.
In the blink of an eye, I didn't mean it. I wanna get away. I gotta get away. They can't pin this one on me. I need an alibi. I need an alibi in my dreams. I can fly in my dreams. Can you tell a lie for me? I need an alibi. A little alibi.
You can hear a little bit of saturation kind of brings the notes out in the mid-range a little bit better, and when he stops singing, like during that Leslie guitar solo, you know, you can hear it a little better. It sort of fills in. Sometimes I think of saturation like spackle. And I'm only using it in the mid-range. I don't want to affect the very low end. I don't want to provoke the very high end, and I'm turning on oversampling so that we minimize the aliasing. Aliasing is a huge problem when it comes to any kind of excitation. Actually, when you're done interpreting, I'll turn it off and on so we can listen to the difference.
In the blink of an eye, I didn't mean it. I wanna get away.
You can hear it in the very top of the drum kit.
They can't pin this one on me. I need an alibi. I need an alibi in my dreams. I can fly in my dreams. Can you tell a lie for me? I need an alibi. A little alibi.
So with the oversampling turned on, I can hear the reverb better. It sounds much clearer and deeper and less stressed. Sorry, I have to have some fun. Excuse me for a moment. Come on. Come on. Which is it? Come on. There we go. Yes. Because we don't get to be creative very much in mastering, so we can do stuff like that. Little crossfade.
I need an alibi.
Yeah, that feels good, right? All right.
Loves me now. Alibi. How can she feel this way? No one can see. She's the invisible girl. Everyone turns their head. Written on some wall. Come down backwards. Time to lift off. Let there be rock. The time will come. I didn't mean it.
Mix engineers. Jeez. Wow. It's the best we can do. Okay. So that's that EP. So if you like nasty, it's cool. I mean, and actually, I mean that seriously. Like for some, like electronica, where there's a lot of like soft synths with a lot of sort of gauzy high end, a little bit of aliasing might sound kind of exciting. But it's not harmonic information. It's non-harmonic distortion. So it's never going to feel like it's part of the music. It's like an overlay, like a sheen of noise. So that's what you have. You know, I want to say that there's no good or bad. There's understanding what's happening and what to listen for. And once you know what to listen for, then you can make the decisions that you want to make. Most of the time, aliasing doesn't sound very good to me, but but sometimes it's not objectionable. There are some saturation plugins, like I think Sound Toys makes a saturation tool that if it oversamples, it falls apart. It just doesn't even work. So, some are designed just in such a way that you have to accept the aliasing. Well, I don't have to worry so much about the sort of artist identity piece, the getting consistency across a record. But in my mind, there's no such thing as just mastering singles, in that when you finish a master and you send it out into the world, listeners are probably going to it's going to show up in a playlist on Spotify or Apple Music or whatever. They'll hear some song and then your song and then another song. So you still have to think about how it will fit into all of the other songs that are released. But yeah, you don't have to think about it in quite the same way. So I want to just go back for 1 second to this question about aliasing and certain kinds of distortion. One of the things that you learn pretty quickly in mastering is that everything you do generates a little bit of distortion. Which adds sort of a high-end accent. Even if you're rolling out bass, you end up with an accent in the high end. not just because you're taking out bass, or if you add bass. Another source of distortion is limiting. So this is a 100 hertz tone. The minute you start adding limiting, you get this non-musical harmonic information. You all hear that? Right? I'm only like a third of a dB into the limiter. So you get aliasing, you get distortion from limiters, you get a little distortion from your EQ and whatever, and it all sort of adds up to an overabundance of high frequency stuff. So that's one of the reasons I work really hard to kind of manage the contribution of all of my tools, the extent to which they're contributing distortion. So maybe now would be the time to take a look at the tracks that were submitted and talk them through. So why don't we start with yours? So it's a special occasion. We have both the arranger and the mix engineer here, so I can listen and I can ask them questions about what they meant, about what were you thinking. So, what do you think? This is actually a great sort of technique. Is you turn away from someone, you hit play, and then you turn back, and they get a totally different perspective on their own work. You don't even have to say anything. So, what do you think? There's my general sense, I mean, the arrangement is cool and the realization of the arrangement is cool. There are these key moments of, the sort of big gestures where there are accents and moments where, it's supposed to be exciting and it feels exciting, but everything feels very band limited to me. Like there's not a lot of sort of real open low end. There's not really much air. I'm not sure what's contributing to that, whether it's compression within sort of the individual elements, or if it's something in the samples. No, these are not samples. These are Bulgarian strings, right? Recording. So, yeah. It feels like it needs to be unpacked. Like everything's kind of here, and I want it to be here. The other thing that occurs to me is it feels a little dry. Like there's a sense of sonic sweep I would expect from an orchestral, a John Williams sort of thing. And you could argue that this is more modern, and we don't want to refer back to that old school sound and whatever, which is totally legit. But I think a little bit of sort of reverb and depth would add to the sense of drama. Yeah, so I'm going to play with it a little bit and see. So we also have the stems, so we could sort of drill down a level of detail and see if we couldn't sort of work from the inside more from the mix engineer's perspective to open it up. But let me see what I could do in a mastering pass. You have to be careful taking too much away from what I'm doing here, given the monitoring. It already feels a little unpacked, a little more open. Like even when the piccolo sort of figure happens, it feels like it's a little bit more in context. I feel like I wish the strings had a little more body. So when the string melodies are happening, they feel like they're not sort of filling out the front of the concert stage. You know, it's like when I'm sitting in the concert hall, I would expect when you have that like tooty string section thing happening for them to be a little more forward. I was actually surprised that the compression was helping. I didn't think it would, but it seemed like just a low ratio, little squeeze at the top seemed to help it. confess, this was like a post unagi, post sake, late night 10-minute version that I did in the hotel room. So with the stems. But you know, the reverb is cool. Um, if not a little bit much. Whoa, wait a minute. Why is my version so much louder than yours? I guess that makes me a mastering engineer. I don't know. No, yeah, there's no other anything going on out here. So I think it's just the EQ, just like clearing things up a little bit. I'm using a little transient shaping on the drums too, just to give them a little, and that's from Neutron, not from Ozone. Um, let's see. Oh, I turned it off again. Yeah, just here for the middle of the drums, and then that's sort of a drum EQ to get a little bit of the soupy, sort of low mid, a little out of the way of the rest of the instruments. I tried to avoid the temptation of like remixing it because I'd had a lot of unagi. so so I also thought maybe I'd just quickly pull up the other track that was sent in by the person who is not here, whose name I can't remember. So you get the vibe, you know it's supposed to happen, but it feels kind of murky. Like it's just not enough. And what's the name of the instrument? Shimasen? Yeah, which is really cool, but it almost feels like it's a little too separated from the rest of the track. Um, we want this to feel a little more rock and roll. So again, this is something I just quickly put together last night. Let's see what it sounds like. So this is a case where I actually used Ozone 11 to try to shape the vocal a little better. I was actually taken back to some like Nirvana records, and I wanted a little bit more of the sort of roar and presence from Kurt Cobain's voice. Um, so there's a little EQ on the vocal before the mastering treatment. I also felt like the very low end of the mix was cheated a little bit, like it was missing a little bit of subharmonic sort of resonance. And this is unfortunately something that is not in Isotope's portfolio. But I have a couple of plugins that I like to use if I need to synthesize some very low end. There's one called Root 1 and there's another one called Low Ender. But I think, Shota, you should definitely let them know that they need to make one. So, anyway, let's see what this sounds like. Oh, did you want to say what I just said? Okay. Let's find out.
You checkmate. Nobody knows 選曲の結果つまりをやるべきは切磋琢磨半端な差が保てリモーザー逃がれるわないつも語るカマリファッファッファ描く理想が首絞めてクラックダウンライク定型敵の連携手持ちの駒が常にチェックメイト盗まれなめなしじゃちょっと笑うそこなし No chance No chance It's the right It's the right I am for he quick hands on myself
It's starting to sound exciting. I may be out of words, but I'm happy to entertain questions about what I'm doing here. But I feel like just like the dynamism of the track feels a little more vivid. It feels like it's got more sort of energy. Again, feels more full frequency. I'm sorry he's not here because I'm curious to know how much high pass filtering he's using. That lack of very, very low end suggests to me that he was using high pass filtering pretty aggressively in the mix, which is what was inspiring me to bring in a little bit of that subharmonic energy. But now it feels angry in an appropriate way. So I'm happy to entertain questions or to kind of review anything that I've gone over so far. And there's one more example I could unpack, but before I do, one of the questions that I think is inside some of the questions from earlier about how mixing impacts mastering. Ultimately, I challenge all the mix engineers to make mixes that are so good I can't make them better. I mean, that really should be the goal, is to make a mix that's so good it can't be improved. Um, and I've had that happen a few times in my career where there was just nothing to do. And you have to know when you're at that point when there's nothing to do. This just sounds great. Let it go. Um, so, mix engineers sometimes ask questions like, should I add a little more reverb because it'll get dry in mastering, or should I add less because it will get wetter, or should I make it less bright because it'll get brighter, or vice versa? And I would encourage people not to try to engage in that guesswork, but rather to try to make things sound great. And the only exception to this is around level. If there's a question about do I compress or not, if there's not a good reason to compress, don't do it. Do I limit or not? If the limiter isn't doing anything for you, don't do it. But otherwise, I think, just trying to make it great is that's ridiculous advice, and yet it's absolutely true. So, I mean, first of all, I really enjoy and kind of lean into the idea that I'm reacting to something that someone's given me. And so I want to hear their idea so I can work with it. Um, and if you hedge by delivering stems, then you're not really sort of laying out an artistic vision or an artistic idea. The other thing that you have to be careful about is that it's often the case that stems won't sum in the same way that a two mix sums, depending on what's going on downstream in terms of two mix processing. Having said that, so if somebody wants to send stems, I would say, let me hear your mix, and then I'm happy to have stems in my hip pocket just in case. But when you start working with stems, you do start wandering a little bit into mixing territory, and at the very least, it's going to take longer, I think, because you've opened up more options. And if somebody wants me to sort of master from their mix session, I usually will book 2 days to do it, or 2 sessions to do it, where I sort of do any kind of rebalancing work, and then I'll come back and put my mastering hat on and master that. I'm not doctrinaire about it. The thing I don't like is when mastering engineers insist on stems, because the implication there is that they know better, and I think that's a bad point of view to have. So, I mean, any other questions? There's a thought that I want to at least leave you with, which is, I mean, first of all, enjoy your work. This is an endless pursuit and exploration of something that's really fun to explore, and sometimes frustrating as hell. And you're never done. You're never there. I mean, I don't feel like I'm there. I'm still learning. I'm still growing. I'm still evolving in my work. And if, for me, if I felt like I had just gotten to the point where I could just master by numbers or something, I probably would stop doing it, because that's no longer interesting. Sometimes I think people feel a little discouraged when they feel like they're not able to do the thing that they see somebody else do. But you should remember that that person feels the same way about somebody else. There's always somebody, we're always aspiring to something, and we're always growing, and we're always learning. And hopefully you take some inspiration from that. Arigatou gozaimasu. Until next time, thank you.